Hello and welcome to another episode of The Closing Track, the official podcast of Another Ascending Lark, where music and the Christian worldview collide, and Grandma got run over by the reindeer because Rudolph decided to take his friends out drinking, had a little bit too much eggnog before it came time to deliver all the presents, thus sparking one of the weirdest Christmas specials of all time.
I'd watch it.
Have you not seen that?
No, I mean the whole Rudolph getting drunk.
Oh, well.
Sort of thing, like adding that to the one. But yeah, I've seen the actual Grandma got run over by a reindeer special, and it was very strange.
It was the ultimate example of marketing for a song. I mean, you have, the famous country song, Grandma Got Run Over by a Reindeer. And what better way to capitalize on the popularity of the song by making an animated Christmas special?
That's what they did for Frosty the Snowman and Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer. But those worked out very well.
Yeah, but those worked out very well. I don't necessarily know if I could say that the Grandma Got Run Over by a Reindeer was actually good.
Yeah.
I mean, because it was like stereotypes everywhere. I mean, at least with Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer, you had Yukon Cornelius and a bunch of other, fantastical characters that...
The dentist elf.
Yeah, the dentist elf. I mean, hello, that's, totally breaking every stereotype because, what elf wants to be a dentist, right?
Yeah, and then it's like, oh, the abominable snowman is mean because he has a lot of toothaches. Let's pull all his teeth. Now he's fine.
Now he's normal, like the rest of humans who have toothaches, who magically turn into normal, decent human beings because their tooth problems are taken care of.
Yep.
That's what Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer is really for. It is a subtle advertisement to convince you to go to the dentist.
I could definitely see that.
That's the whole point of the show. It's not to promote Santa or Rudolph or the popular song. It's to convince you to go to the dentist and stop being a jerk.
Yeah, and Santa was kind of a jerk in that too. He's like, oh, how dare you, Donna? Your son has a shiny red nose. You should be ashamed of yourself.
There's so many subtexts in that. Now that I think about it, I haven't seen it in several years, but it was definitely like a Christmas tradition to sit in front of the TV with some homemade sugar cookies and watch Rudolph every year.
Yeah, I watch it a couple of times at work, and I'm just like, this is an incredibly racist film. Like, that's basically what it is racism against Rudolph.
It is a racist film. Wow, I didn't even think about it like that. There's so many subtexts in that you don't miss until you get older, and then you realize, oh, there's more going on in this than I first thought there was.
We also watched that Little Drummer Boy special.
I've never seen that. Somehow that one has always evaded my attention.
Well, first off, the animation was significantly worse than I remembered it being. And then there was this weird song by this Arabian guy singing about the goose is hanging high and he's wealthy and stuff. And when the goose is flying low, things are bad. I'm like, I don't even know what that means.
I don't even know what that means.
Like, I always thought when I watched it as a kid, I was like, oh, I'm just young. I don't know these sayings. And now I'm older. I'm like, I still don't know what he's talking about.
I still don't understand what he's trying to tell me. My name is Austin. I am the head honcho of this shindig. I am the host who does not necessarily believe in the existence of Santa.
And I'm Brett. I'm the other guy here. And if Santa did exist, his beard would not be as awesome as mine.
Maybe that's because you are Santa. Because, you just have amnesia.
In that case, I guess this Christmas I need to break into multiple homes and take their cookies and milk as an offering in hopes that I'll give them presents.
You can't be Santa because you're a stick. And you don't gain weight. Santa's fat. You're not.
I'll get a few tubs of lard. I'm sure that I'll gain something by then.
And maybe have a couple of heart attacks and diabetes in the process.
And one thing I have to say, too, about the whole Little Drummer Boy thing. Who on earth thinks it's a good idea for someone to play the drums in the middle of the night for a newborn baby?
Jesus.
I'm just saying, imagine Joseph and Mary, they're just in there, they just had a baby, all that stuff. And this guy with a drum comes in, hey, can I play the drums for your baby?
No,
go away.
Go away. We just got him to sleep, and you come with your drums, and now he's awake. Go away.
Yeah.
If somebody did that to me, I'd be like, I'm not having this. Go away. Take your drums, go buy yourself an electronic drum kit with some headphones, and bang on that so only you can hear it.
Yeah.
Because electronic drum kits are terrible, and
yeah.
So it is time for the end of the year stuff from us. Definitely, definitely thankful that we're able to do something like this at all. We took a bit of a gamble at the start of our season, which was in September and not January. We were all gone for 9 months.
Yeah.
Soon you won't be able to play that card on me anymore because this season will be over. It'll be a new season. We're actually going to start in January like we did in 2013.
Yeah, that'll be nice.
Yes, that will be nice. But we're thankful that because of podcasting that we were able to cover a pretty decent amount of albums, even though we were gone for 9 months out of the year. So we're excited that we get to do a 2-part end of the year special. And so because of that, we are not going to be doing any news today, even though this was a pretty heavy news week for the music world. This was definitely a major news week, and I kind of wish that we could have covered some of it. But because of all of the things we're going to do today as part 1 of our end of the year special, we will not just say anything about that, at least on the show. If you follow us on Facebook or on Twitter, you've probably have seen some of my remarks on some of the things that have been going on. But we have this episode, and then we have next episode, and next episode is going to be the episode where we go through the top 10, and we also crown a few, and I mean a few, best of awards pertaining to a couple of genres. We can definitely do one for metal, we can definitely do one for rock, we can definitely do one for worship, and a couple other genres. So we will just do a few of those just because we can, and we covered enough to make some of those categories possible. But if you're looking for the top 10, this is not that episode. That episode is going to be next week. So what we're going to do today, hold on to your Santa hats. We're going to cover every album that we've covered this year.
Over 9,000 of them.
Yep, over 9,000 of them. So hold on tight.
Yes.
Because here we go. Just kidding. So we have 45 albums that we covered this year, which, I mean, again, considering that we were only active for 3 months in podcasting, that's pretty good considering I think we covered like 75 for the entirety of 2013. So I think we did a pretty good job and had a pretty good comeback. But we have several new albums to review to round out the rest of the year and get all of the things that we listened to in the year on the table and done with. And then we are going to briefly recap and revisit every album that we've covered this year, just so that we can close the 2014 review season with every album that we were able to get a hold of and listen to. We're going to do this by release date. So we're going to start from the beginning of the year, and we're going to work our way to the end of the year, and Brett and I will trade off as the release dates let us. So, Brett, are you ready?
I'm ready.
All right. Well, let's get started. Let's get started with a review from an album that technically didn't come out this year.
Yeah.
So, on Christmas Eve 2013,
Which is a really weird day.
which is a terrible release date. I'm sorry. That is a horrible release date.
No one's going to be like, ooh, Christmas Eve, I'm going to go out and buy this new album.
Yeah, and there's a reason why the press, the new release press, like, had a hard time picking up on it, was because it kind of got buried in, the fact that it came out on freaking Christmas Eve. But it was an album that I had been waiting for most of the year, and it was an album from a group of people that I count as being musical heroes and lyrical heroes in my life. Jason Wisdom of Becoming the Archetype and Alex Kinnis, formerly of Becoming the Archetype and formerly of Aletheia, came together to do an album under a new project called Solomors, and the album was called Depravity's Demise, and it took them all year. They produced the whole entire album on their own. They had a real successful Kickstarter to get this album out, and it was definitely worth the wait. It was definitely worth the wait, and it's been a solid death metal release all year long. To put it a little bit in perspective, if you're familiar with Becoming the Archetype's discography, Alex Kinnis was present for their second album, The Physics of Fire, and then afterwards left to go on to do other things. So, in a way, this debut album from Solomors is a kind of a continuation of the sounds that were developed in The Physics of Fire, albeit without some of the more progressive elements. This is more of a straightforward death metal album, and even though it does have a few progressive elements thrown in there, it would be a little inaccurate to call it progressive death metal as a whole. But lyrically, Jason Wisdom's lyrics are once again very deep, very solid. He is an outstanding songwriter in his scene when it comes to writing lyrics about subjects that have depth and have meaty subjects to chew on. Like the first song, Standing in Air, is a play on words to a book written by Francis Beckwith and Greg Koukl about moral relativism. I mean, hello.
Wow.
Yeah, I mean, hello. Who else is doing that? And at least in the metal scene. I mean, Theocracy does that, but Theocracy is on a different spectrum of metal. And so Jason Wisdom is definitely one of my heroes. He's an outstanding apologist. He's a really cool guy. And to see him translate his apologetics into his lyrical content definitely pays off. And then there are several other songs as that goes on that follow more biblically driven material. Oh my gosh, why is Evernote being stupid? Evernote, you're failing me. What's the deal here? Plotting in Vain. Plotting in Vain is largely driven off of several psalms that talk about the Lord rising up and going to war against their enemies. You have several instrumentals. I'm not even going to try to pronounce that. You have several instrumentals that really go through and work some very diverse elements of death metal and really iron themselves out to resolve in real satisfying ways. Words are hard. Overall, just because we got 10 million things to cover, overall, it's not going to redefine death metal by any means, but for a release that's entirely self-produced, it's an outstandingly mixed album. It's outstandingly well written. It's very enjoyable. If you're a fan of Becoming the Archetype or any of Jason Wisdom or Alex Kinnis's work, you definitely should have picked up on this by now. If you haven't, thank goodness it's not too late, because it's going to be out there until, the internet ends, and so you can pick it up anytime and listen to it. If I were to pin this, I would pin this at probably a 7.5. It's definitely been one of my favorite releases of the year, even though it's not necessarily a game changer by any respect. So, Solomore's Depravity's Demise, if you're into death metal, check it out. Recap real quick. Casting Crowns, Thrive. Just to briefly recap this one, it's more of the same. They didn't really push themselves overall. There are a couple of songs that show a lot of promise and actually testify against them, that they're capable of doing better, but time remains to be seen if they're actually going to evolve or if they're going to stay in the same basic rut with just a couple of musical variations here and there. I was hoping for a breakthrough. No breakthrough has come yet. Brett, your turn. Yeah. And
the next album was Within Temptation by Hydra. This album...
No, backwards.
Backwards.
Backwards. It's Hydra.
I said Hydra by Within Temptation.
No, you said it backwards.
Yeah, anyways. Within Temptation's Hydra. Words are hard. But this album was aptly named Hydra because of all the various styles involved. It had several different guest vocalists in there. And it definitely was a very experimental album that worked out for sure. There were really not any rough patches except for a couple of songs that were kind of blah. And overall, I definitely enjoyed it.
I still couldn't get into that. I tried again. I couldn't do it. I like Let Us Burn and Nevermind. I mean, I tried. I don't know what it was, but I just couldn't do that. John Mark McMillan, Borderland, definitely one of the most anticipated releases of the year and did not disappoint in the slightest bit. Definitely still his best album to date, even though it came out in March, it still is the best album that he's ever put out. Great lyrics, great songwriting, great imagery, outstanding use of various styles. He really does have a very distinct sound for what he does. If you're not picked up John Mark McMillan's album Borderland, you're definitely missing out on one of the best releases that the Christian market put out this year and really in a while. Demon Hunter, Extremist. Disappointing. Not what I wanted it to be. It's not a bad album in terms of mixing. In fact, in terms of mixing, it's actually an outstanding album. But for calling it Extremist, it's their softest album to date, like plainly. I mean, to follow up post True Defiance with something so soft as nothing wrong with that per se, but it didn't solidify very well. So Need to Breathe, Rivers in the Wasteland, the more mellow side of the Need to Breathe gang, with more of a stripped down approach to their songwriting, definitely more mature, definitely a little bit more authentic in a lot of ways. They definitely wear their faith on their sleeve, but they don't shove it down your throat. It was definitely a more laid back approach to their sound and to their songwriting, and quite a bit more introspective and reflective than it is, I'll say, some of their prior work. Anubis Gate. Brett, you can actually comment on this one since this is one that you listen to.
I actually never listened to the album.
How's that possible?
I'm kidding.
Okay, I was like, how's that possible? We listened to it on the way back to the camp that must not be named. Anubis Gates Horizons, which is definitely definitely a running candidate for album of the year. Outstanding surprise of a release from a progressive metal band that I had never heard of. Amazing songwriting, absolutely outstanding songwriting. Great lyrics. While this band doesn't necessarily have some of the avant-garde experimentation like Dream Theater and some of these other progressive metal bands have, their element of progression is that these guys change keys like other bands change chords in a song.
It is intense.
But here's the thing, is that even though they're changing keys like every 2 measures, it seems like, it's totally cohesive, it totally flows. And as far as theory goes, I mean, this is a field day for any music theory nut. Outstanding songwriting all the way. I had a couple of songs that maybe weren't as strong as the rest of the album, but this
like Erasure.
Yeah, like the closing track, which, oh gosh, it was such a disappointing closing track, especially after the song before.
Yeah, just if they would have moved that track somewhere else, then it would have been a lot better of an album, I think.
Yeah, oh, definitely would have been a lot better of an album. Death by poor track placement. But it's really not death. It's more like a flesh wound by poor track placement. Anubis Gates Horizons was definitely one of the best releases that we heard all year long. And it's definitely one of Brett and mine's favorite releases for the whole year. So if you're into progressive metal, or even if you're a metalhead but you don't necessarily like the screaming aspect of it, the vocal work on this album is phenomenal. So it's definitely something worth checking out if that tickles your fancy in any way, I guess. New review. This one's going to be fun. Spectral Lores 3. Brad, have you ever heard of Spectral Lore?
I have not.
That's okay, because it's a one-man black metal project.
Ah, interesting.
That would explain why you haven't heard of it. That would explain why I haven't heard of it. Because there's only one place on the internet you can buy it, and that's Bandcamp.
Huh.
I mean, that's literally the only official account that this guy has on the internet is his album page on Bandcamp. To call this album a very difficult album to listen to and review is such an understatement. This might be the hardest album I've listened to the whole year. First of all, the mixing. The mixing is horrible. It is terrible. It is disgusting. It made me want to shoot myself.
Does he use a drum machine?
No, but it's black metal. And if you do black metal, it's kind of a reputation that, unless on certain occasions, if you're going to do black metal, it has to sound bad because, black metal.
Yeah.
So on that part, I can give a little bit of grace and forgiveness. But if this album had been mixed correctly, I'm just going to go ahead and say that if this album had been mixed correctly, and if this album had been mixed well, this would have been the album of the year. Like, as far as the compositions go, unbelievable. I mean, you have to really sit down and use some brain power to parse through what's being played, because the mix just certainly doesn't help you do that. But when you take into account how long this album is, I mean, this album is like 80 minutes long, even though it's only 7 songs. It's got an instrumental in there that is better than anything Opeth has ever done in terms of acoustic. In fact, it is the best acoustic guitar piece that any metal band I've ever heard do, period.
Wow.
Bar none. I mean, absolutely incredible. The screaming, totally unintelligible. You can't make out a single word. But when you go and read the lyrics for this, lyrically, this would have been album of the year if the lyrics were actually understandable. Even though it's rooted in a secular worldview, it's very mythological driven, very, very solid imagery. And the album concludes with a investigation into one's cosmic significance and one's cosmic meaning, which the Christian worldview has a totally different answer than the answer he gives, but the way he communicates it is very beautiful, very well written, very elegant. You just can't understand any of it. You just can't understand any of it. So outstanding release, even though it's pretty much impossible to find. It's gotten near universal acclaim on every metal site that I've followed. So if I were to pin a review on it, or pin a number on it, I would pin it at a 9, even though taking into account the mixing, or the lack of mix, I should say. As far as the music and the lyrics go, this is phenomenal. This is incredible. New review again, All Sons and Daughters, self-titled album All Sons and Daughters. I got to see All Sons and Daughters back earlier this year, and it was a shorter show than what I wished it would have been, but it was still definitely a real solid show. They pulled off their live material in a real respectful and it was a worship concert, but it didn't really feel more like a concert part. It felt more like a worship service. And so their follow-up album, self-titled All Sons and Daughters, was definitely full of high expectations. And while it didn't necessarily disappoint the expectations, I can't help but shake the feeling that it's time for the expectations to change. There's nothing on this album that you'll hear that you're going to go, oh, well, that's stretching out and pushing new boundary for them. It's very safe. It's very familiar. It's still really good. I mean, they still have this intimate indie folk worship thing down better than really anyone else I can think of. But as far as the sound of it, yeah, they're getting to a point soon where they are going to need to do some evolution to avoid becoming stale, and some would say that they've already reached the point of being stale. It's a great album. There's there's some really really good songs in there. There are the studio treatments of God with Us and one other song that Evernote will not let me see because Evernote decided it wants to break down at the moment, and it's kind of hard to do a show when Evernote won't let you see what you're trying to do. But anyway, there's also several instances of guest writing throughout the show. Sandra McCracken shows up for one song towards the middle of the album that is actually one of my favorite All Sons and Daughters songs. For Your Glory and My Good is actually a pretty gut-wrenching tune, even though it's a real lighthearted folk song. It's more or less a song in the middle of suffering and refusing to cave in and despair, but to acknowledge that in the suffering, God is working out the situation for His glory and for one's good. So it's a very gut-wrenching tune. It gets a little bit stale and repetitive towards the end as far as the tracks blending together, but it's not too big of a deal. If I were to pin a number on this, I would pin this at a 7. Only because it's good, but it still feels very safe and stale and familiar in many, many places. So, yeah, I mean, it's not a bad album by any means. Coldplay's Ghost Stories, I still don't really know how I felt about this one. I mean, as far as the album goes, it wasn't necessarily a bad album, but it's definitely not my favorite Coldplay album. It might actually be my least favorite Coldplay album. Very mellow, very laid back. They scaled it back quite a bit in response to Milo Zailoto, but I think they scaled it back maybe a little too much. So if you're a Coldplay fan, then you should already be a fan of this album. But if you're not a Coldplay fan, then oh well. You're not really missing out on much with this Coldplay release. One more, and then Brett, you can do one, and I can take a beer drink. Crowder's Neon Steeple. So we talked about in a prior episode how much David Crowder is like the cornerstone for all the names related to this. Another Ascending Lark is a play on words on the closing track of Not Give Us Rest, A Collision 3 + 4 = 7, and what a surprise, the name of the show is called The Closing Track, which is in homage to the name of the track that Another Ascending Lark is based from. You get it. We're kind of David Crowder nerds. What? I don't know either. And so he left David Crowder and more or less became Crowder, just himself without the band, and released Neon Steeple, which was definitely a very highly anticipated release. In fact, iTunes crowned it as the best Christian rock album of the year, which, okay, that's a respectable choice. He had touted the album as being a folktronica album, an album that blends folk and electronica. And here's the thing. Just because you have a banjo playing over some synthesizer beats, that does not necessarily mean that you have integrated folk into electronica. Because there's more to the folk sound than the banjo.
Yeah.
Which he does the banjo thing really well. I mean, I don't know if it's him playing it or somebody else. He does the banjo thing really well. But as far as the fusion of techno and folk, does not necessarily pull it off as well as it could be. Now, this is his first foray into this by himself, so hopefully if he decides to go this path again for his next album, he might integrate that a little bit better and make it a little bit stronger. And even the songs that do have the folk and the electronic mixed together actually turn out to be really, really good songs. It even starts right off the bat after the intro with a folk blend song, "My Beloved," which has a real nice. It starts off sort of like a campground, boot stomping, clapping campfire song, and then moves into some techno elements. "Hands of Love" is definitely the strongest techno song on the album and has a banjo playing along with it, which again doesn't necessarily mean that you're incorporating folk into a electronic song just because you've got a banjo in there. And here's the thing, is that he touted this as being a folktronica album, but like 3/4 of the album are just straight up folk and gospel songs, especially the last half of the album. Everything beyond "Hands of Love" is pretty much old-time gospel folk, which sounds awesome. Like, it's really good, but it's definitely a little bit inaccurate to call this album folktronica, and it's also not a very homogenous album. There's definitely some weighted issues on this album stacked towards the end of the album. "Jesus is Calling" is a classic hymn that he's definitely retreated and done really well. "Ain't No Grave" is another one of the campground boot stopping songs that he does just without the techno. It's real catchy. It's real well done. "Lift Your Hand, Weary Sinners" is the same thing. "Come As You Are" is his worship offering for this particular album, and it's not bad, but it's also not very... it's not amazing either. And the same thing with "Here's My Heart." "Here's My Heart" is basically a clone of "For the Glory of It All." It doesn't sound it's more or less a clone of that song, which is really disappointing to close the album out on that. Overall, I've thought a lot about this album, and overall, I think this album shows just how much the other members of the Crowder Band played in achieving the David Crowder Band sound. And now that he's gone, you can see, or now that they're gone, you can see just how much their creative weight was present. It was not just David Crowder holding up the David Crowder Band, which we kind of already knew that beforehand, but like that's been common knowledge beforehand. But Crowder as a one-man project is still good. It's just not up to the caliber of his previous work. So to pin this at a number, I would pin this at an 8. Because the folk and the old gospel stuff that he treats really well. It's very faithful. It's beautiful. The goal of having a folktronica album didn't necessarily execute that very well, but it's still a solid album. All right, Brett, I'm going to have some Shiners here to talk for a little bit.
Sounds good. Next album up is Linkin Park's The Hunting Party. This was definitely an incredible release. A lot of people, including me, had expected that Linkin Park's next album was going to be continuing in the foray of the more electronic sound as they had been, but they completely changed direction again. And this is their hardest album that they've ever released. They have a few songs with, co-writers and contributors, and I still say Rebellion, featuring the guitarist from System of a Down, one of the best songs Linkin Park's ever put out. It is incredible, and I loved this album. Old and new fans of Linkin Park alike will enjoy this, I think. Definitely a solid release.
I'll probably have to give it a listen through in between, or well, I guess during the Christmas break, for the couple of weeks that we don't have any new releases to cover. So, another recap of an album, Mastodon's Once More Around the Sun. This was originally slated to come out at the same day as Opeth's Pale Communion, but Opeth's Pale Communion got pushed back, and I'm kind of thankful that happened because I was like, oh my gosh, Opeth and Mastodon coming out on the same day? Like, what do I do? That's such a first world problem that you have two great metal bands releasing albums on the same day and you don't know which one to listen to first.
Yeah.
Opeth's album ended up being the phenomenally better album, but anyway. Mastodon's Once More Around the Sun definitely continues the precedent that they've set with The Hunter. It's not a concept album as their prior discography has established really well. It's radio primed. The whole album is radio primed, but they're solid radio primed cuts. Excellent choruses, some real solid solos, real trimmed back songwriting. There's nothing on this album that's necessarily groundbreaking for Mastodon except for the fact that they decided to scale it back, which I think they did really well. And the internet seems to agree that they did really well, but I don't really give a care about the internet's opinion because it's the internet.
Even though we're technically part of the internet now.
Mind blown.
Yep.
Mind blown. Anyway, Mastodon's Once More Around the Sun. If you didn't get into Mastodon's more experimental and like crazy work, and this is the album to get into because it's definitely far more accessible, far more listenable, and far more engaging on a common level. Like anyone could pick this album up and listen to it and enjoy it, which I think is something to pull off for them to pull off is an impressive feat considering that they've made their name on writing these really extravagant concept albums based off of Moby Dick, based off of Stephen Hawking, based off of well, beer burp.
Wow,
that came out of nowhere. What was I talking about? Stephen Hawking.
Yeah.
Stephen Hawking and several other famous people and just the things that they come up with. So Mastodon's Once More Around the Sun. If you are a Mastodon fan, you probably have already listened to it thousands of times. I know I have. If you're not a Mastodon fan, but if you are into their scene, it's definitely worth listening to.
And Rise Against released The Black Market. I Don't Want to Be Here Anymore was the main track that was released on radio a lot, which I now can no longer listen to without thinking about the professor from Futurama.
I don't want to live on this planet anymore.
Yeah. But this album was framed by excellent tracks in the beginning and at the end, but it suffered by mediocre and okay, decent songs around the middle. I mean, if they sort of rearranged the track list, maybe this would have sounded better, or maybe even just
death by poor track placement.
Yeah, or even just taking out a few of the tracks and seeing if they could do better. But overall, it wasn't horrible. It was decent, but it definitely could have been better.
War of Ages, Supreme Chaos. This came out towards the end of the summer season at the camp that must not be named, and was definitely. I mentioned this last week, actually, just how much of a comeback album this was for War of Ages and how much of an album that this band really needed. This was the shot of nitrogen that they needed to really take off and really start flying. Some subtle electronic work on the album that adds some real nice touches to it. The inclusion of Jack Daniels, the guitarist, not the drink, or at least that we know of.
Probably both.
Probably both, but actually, no, let's not say probably both.
Possibly both.
Sure, possibly both. Definitely sets some outstanding guitar work for this album, which is what War of Ages really, really needed. They really needed a breakthrough in their songwriting and their guitar work, and this album has that in spades. They really did some real solid songwriting, some real solid lyrics. It's not a game changer by any means for the scene, but for the band, this was the revival that they needed. Otherwise, they were going to really fade into obscurity really quick. 1,000 Foot Crutches, Oxygen, and Hail. I don't even know what to say on this one. This was a disappointment and even suffered even more so as time went on. It started out really promising. It started off with some real solid cuts, and then the back half of the album is completely forgettable and just really bland. Yeah, that's all I'll say on that. Opeth's Pale Communion. Gosh, this album has gotten so much better with time. Initially, it was a solid album with the first couple of weeks it came out, but even listening to it in the car yesterday on the way to the camp that must not be named, gosh, this is such an outstanding album for Opeth. If you are a type of Opeth fan that thinks that Ackerfeld needs to go back to screaming, again, it's a disappointing album in that there's no screaming on it, again, and that's okay. Here's the thing, that's okay. The sounds that they pull off in here are definitely, it's an Opeth album. In the strictest sense, it sounds like something that Opeth would do, just without the screams, and they pull it off really well. Ackerfeld himself has commented that this album would be the album that exists between Ghost Reveries and Heritage, and would imagine that Watershed had never existed. This would be the album that replaced Watershed, which is a terrible thought because Watershed is my favorite album, and Watershed is my favorite album on vinyl, bar none. So Opeth's Pale Communion, definitely one of the best releases of the year. Excuse me. It definitely did not disappoint in any way, shape, or form. And yeah, I want more. That's the thing, is that I wanted more from this album just because of how good it was. The closing track for that album is probably one of the best songs Opeth has ever done. And oh gosh, such a spine-chilling release.
And Maroon 5 released their album 5, not V.
Yes, I'm glad.
Sorry again for that mistake earlier.
Oh my gosh, that was such an embarrassing correction to make.
But this album, it had a few good songs, but overall, this album was kind of meh. I mean, it had a cover of Sex and Candy. I don't even know who originally sings that song. I didn't like the original song. I thought it was really boring and just lame, and Maroon 5's cover was even worse. But I mean,
He had one job, Maroon 5.
yeah,
He had one job.
every band is allowed at least one, sort of downward trending album every
This
now
album
and then.
this album did really well on the charts, though.
Yeah, it did well on the charts, but a lot of that might have been, ooh, Maroon 5, I'll buy their new album. I mean,
Yeah, my dad said that my dad's a big Maroon 5 fan, and he commented that he was going to buy the clean version of the album because I had warned them that, hey, there's quite a bit of language in this album, and he bought the clean version, but he said that the clean version, and this made me laugh so hard whenever he told me this, that in the instances where it's where they would edit it out or whatever, they don't take the root or the stem of the vocals and just trim out the word. They take the final mastered product and literally cut the song out and leave blank space where the word would be.
wow.
So the song more or less pauses and then picks right up after a nanosecond of blank space wherever language would have been in the album, which I'm just like, that's terrible. That's horrible.
Terrible.
So, clean version, fail. Clean version,
Yeah, I mean,
fail.
but hopefully they'll pick back up with their next album. I mean, Maroon 5 definitely is a solid band, and it was kind of sad for me to hear this.
It was, I enjoyed it.
Yeah, I mean, it wasn't
I didn't enjoy
like,
it as much as I wanted to.
Yeah, it wasn't garbage. I mean, they didn't release a steaming pile of crap like one of the other albums I listened to, which we'll discuss later, but it was definitely not as good as what Maroon 5 usually puts out.
Yeah, I would agree. U2 and Lecrae, probably the two of the most significant releases of the year. U2's Songs of Innocence. I managed to snag a vinyl copy of U2's Rattle and Hum, and I was listening to it the other day, and I was thinking about Songs of Innocence, and I was like, wow, how much on the forefront of the music world's conscience is this band, and how relevant in many ways they still are, even though people wish they would go away. And this album and all of the drama that surrounded it, in hindsight, people have finally chilled out about the fact that they had a song or an album sent to their phone against their explicit permission, whatever that means. And people have finally gotten the crap over that. And the reviews have really reflected that once the hype died down, that this album was a solid album. And I've said that from the get-go, that this was an outstanding release from U2. It goes back in time and really focuses on how the band got started even at all, and has some older sounds, has some new sounds, has some sounds from the Joshua Tree era stuff, and has some sounds that I hope they never do again. So it was not a lame or cheapskate or afterthought of an album by any means. It's a full album and should be treated as a full album, even though the way that it was released was extremely unconventional and highly controversial. Lecrae's album, on the other hand, was a solid album. It got #1 on the Billboard Top 200, which is the 5th Christian album, the first Christian hip-hop album to have ever done so. Look, we talked about Lecrae on a whole entire episode and more or less ranted how Lecrae is doing what everybody else in the Christian market needs to be doing. That he is the forerunner and the trendsetter for how to do this right as a Christian and how to make music that's solid music while reflecting and clarifying your faith in the process. And over time, this album has gotten even better and better with release. It's my favorite Lecrae album by far. Definitely my favorite Lecrae album by far, and was one of the year's best releases.
And Slash, along with Miles Kennedy and the Conspirators, released World on Fire, the second album of the, not two artists, not two groups, for Slash to do with this band. And it definitely was a good, solid release. World on Fire, the title track, I think it's overplayed on the radio, but it's still an excellent track. Shadow Life, one of the best songs on the album. It was really long, oh my gosh, really, really long.
How long?
It was over an hour, 70 minutes, something like that.
What?
70-something minutes, yeah.
What?
And I can't remember how many tracks were on it, but it was like...
Oh, I thought you were talking about a song that was really,
No.
really long.
No.
I was like, psh, long songs? Like, dude, we listen to prog metal. Like, what are we... Like, we don't mind long songs.
Yeah, but no, there's no 70-minute song
I was about
on here.
I was about to say, what? Like,
We're not back to the days of Bach or Handel or anything like that. But, I mean, it was a really long album, and it's kind of weird to see an album of this style that long without it being prog, but there wasn't really any garbage in the album. I mean, it was all solid.
For King and Country's Love Wild, Live Free, Love Strong, which secured a Grammy nomination this year.
And it sounds like the most hippie album title ever.
You know, I don't think so. There's a reason wwhy it's titled that, but I don't think it's necessarily because of the hipster ties.
No, not hipster, hippie.
Oh.
Like, if you just saw those words together, love wild, live free, love strong, without any context, that sounds like a hippie saying.
Valid point. This was definitely one of my favorite pop albums from the whole year, just because they know the rule book on writing pop, and they know which rules to break to make it sound familiar, but also make it sound really unique and different. They've done really well on the radio. They've done really well on the charts. They've done really well from the critics. This album is definitely one of the best Christian pop albums, to use the word Christian in air quotes, to have come out, because it is far from stale. It is far from familiar, even though it feels familiar in places. And it's got a fresh, innovative, and a creative direction that is extremely needed in the pop scene on the Christian market side at the moment. They're really pushing the boundary as to how to make pop that people want to hear, but doesn't sound like anything else they're hearing. And so it was definitely one of my favorite pop releases from the year, and I'm glad that it got a Grammy nom. It deserved it.
And Greetings from California by the Madden Brothers was probably the best pleasant surprise for me of the release here. I didn't even know this was a thing until I look on Rhapsody. Oh, the Madden Brothers. Are they? Yes, they are the Madden Brothers from Good Charlotte. Awesome. And what? They're making a folk album. Huh. And they definitely pulled it off successfully. It was an interesting choice to have it on 2 discs. It's not like that long of an album. I mean, it's still average length, but each disc definitely is a complete work on its own. So I do approve of the decision. Definitely a good solid album. If you're hoping for the old Good Charlotte sound, you're not gonna find it, but it is good to see them moving on to another musical project and branching out what they can do with this new folk sound.
The contortionists and language, this is definitely one of my pleasant surprises for the whole year. Gent, which, if you're not familiar with Gent, just think Between the Buried and Me, the Periphery, and Meshuggah, and a bunch of other bands. Only this is more along the lines of progressive metal more than it is straightforward Gent. Some real elaborate soundscapes, some real solid mixing on the band's part. The songwriting is accessible much in the way of Anubis Gates was, minus all of the crazy key changes. The vocal work on this album left a lot to be desired, but as far as the guitar work and as far as some of the effects that some of these guitars pull off, very pleasant ear candy to listen to. It was definitely an album that was not on my radar, and then found its way on my radar, and I'm thankful that it did, because it was definitely one of my favorite albums from the whole year. It was a pleasant surprise. It wasn't really, really solid album. Flyleaf's album, Between the Stars, on the other hand, definitely a disappointment. The new singer, Kristen May, she can sing, and she sounds good, but Flyleaf has definitely gone in the direction of pop rock.
And there's, of course, the really strange scream.
Okay, speaking of that, so I listen to, as a podcaster, I listen to a lot of podcasts, and I listen to several music podcasts. And every single podcast episode that I listened to that had this album, either they were reviewing it or talking about it, whatever, literally every single one of them mentioned that song. It was awesome. I was like, okay, I wasn't crazy for thinking that this sucks.
We're not alone in this.
We're not alone in this, because it was like, you just ruined an otherwise really good song.
Yeah, like you listen to it, it's good. You're like, okay, yeah, this is a very good, very beautiful song. I'm really liking. Wait, what?
What the? The look. I still couldn't even process that when I heard it. I was like, where did this come from?
Like, take the scream away, and it is a fantastic song.
Yeah, take the scream away. It's a fantastic song. With the scream in the song, I quite frankly don't want to listen to it again.
Yeah.
I mean, it literally ruined the whole song. And we're metalheads. I mean, we're all for screaming. I scream. I can scream. But just because I'm a fan of screaming doesn't mean that you stick a scream somewhere and it automatically, makes it a good song.
Yeah, I mean, I've heard bands do it successfully before. I've heard bands scream a lot with the occasional clean vocal. I've heard clean vocals with the occasional scream. It can be done successfully, but this one didn't do it.
No. No, this definitely did not do it. It's mixed like a pop album. It sounds like a pop rock album. This is not the Flyleaf of Lacey Mosley era, which might be the direction that they just have to go from now. This was not the worst release in the world, but it definitely was not something amazing either. And the same thing goes with Sanctus Real's The Dream, which Sanctus Real used to be one of my favorite bands in high school. They used to have a real aggressive, real solid and straightforward sound that was not necessarily groundbreaking or innovative by any means, but was still really well done. And Matt Hammett used to be able to belt out rocker screams like nobody's business. But yeah, I'm done with Sanctus Real. I can't do it anymore. They have gone the way of radio-friendly synth pop, and nothing on this album stands out from anything on their last album. It's slightly better than Run. Slightly better than Run, but not by much. It still sounds the same. It's still written the same. There's nothing really on this album that stands out in any way, and the Sanctus Real of old is definitely dead. They're definitely gone. Stryper's Live at the Whiskey. I was really excited for this.
As was I.
I was really excited for this. And then I listened to it, and the mix is terrible. Like, the mix is awful.
And why on earth did you include Marching into Battle, which is probably the worst song they've ever released?
Yeah, that was definitely a droning moment for me. But the drum mix drowns out everything else. When you have to strain to hear Michael Fox Oz Fox and Michael Sweet's guitars, you have a problem, especially when the cymbals and the hi-hats are so blaringly loud. I mean, the mix for this album really, really killed it. Otherwise, solid release.
Yeah, which I can understand drums drowning out things, especially in a live setting, because drums, are loud. But with a band that's been around as long as Stryper has,
there's
and
no
is as good as Stryper is, there's no excuse at all.
There's no excuse for this. Like, the mix is something I would have expected from like a local band trying to do just an off-the-cuff live album. It's not a good mix.
Which, if I heard a local band that had a mix like this, okay, fair enough. I'd probably enjoy it. I'd probably applaud them for it.
Yeah, you just take it into account. But...
Yeah, they can't do much better. They've probably never recorded professionally. They might not have professional sound mixers doing anything with them. But come on, Stryper. You've been around for so long. You were considered one of the best bands of the 80s when there really weren't that many quote-unquote Christian bands doing what you're doing.
Right.
You are pioneers. Why did you do it like this?
I mean, musically, as far as the performance itself, when you take the mix into account, like, killer album. They nail every solo. Michael Sweet nails the majority of all the high notes with the exception of a handful of them. It sounds great, except that it doesn't sound great.
Yeah, which is weird to say, but if you listen to it, it makes perfect sense.
Yeah, you'll understand if you listen to it. Joe Bonamassa's Different Shade of Blue, which I got to see live this year, and it was an outstanding show.
You're a jerk.
You couldn't have afforded the tickets.
I
barely could have afforded the tickets. If
he comes back in town again, though, I'm going, and you can't.
No.
Okay.
No. If he comes back, I'm totally going again. It was an outstanding show.
If he comes back, I'm doing overtime to afford the ticket.
Yeah, it would be worth it. I mean, gosh, he is such a good musician. He's definitely one of my guitar heroes, and I was definitely looking forward.
Guitar hero.
Different Shade of Blue was definitely a highly anticipated release for me and for quite a few other people, and it didn't disappoint at all. It's gotten better with time as well. Joe's songwriting is as solid as ever. His instrumentation is a little bit more forward-thinking and a little bit more... he branches out a little bit more from his prior established sound. He didn't play any of these songs live, which is okay, but I mean, it definitely makes me look forward to seeing him again when several of these songs would transition to a live album really well. And then Disciples Attack, which was a sort of successful comeback album from Oh God Save Us All, which was an utter major disappointment and was, quite frankly, a terrible album. So it was definitely a comeback album for them. Sounds good on their own. Got a little bit of songwriting issues and some other small things to kink out, but for doing it as an independent release, it's a solid independent release. It sounds really good. There's some throwbacks to some classic Disciple and their classic, really, really aggressive thrash metal sound. Wasn't quite the comeback album that I wished it could be, but it was definitely a solid release from them. All right, Brett, your turn.
And Gerard Way, not Gerald Way, like someone put on Evernote.
That's what it said in Wikipedia.
It's Gerard Way.
That's what it said in Wikipedia.
Well,
I blame Wikipedia.
Yeah, someone trolled you. But anyways, Gerard Way released Hesitant Alien. And like the Madden Brothers, Gerard Way comes from another really famous band, My Chemical Romance, who's the lead singer of that. And they went their separate ways, unfortunately. I'm still depressed about that. But he released...
Join the world.
Yeah. But he released his solo album, and also he, like the Madden Brothers, he went a completely different direction than before. I really don't think I can pin this down as any one particular genre, because he's all over the place. I mean, it works. I mean, he has some Britpop in there, some electronica. I mean, it's very experimental, very interesting, although I was really happy to see that there was at least one song with his brother, the bassist, Mikey Way, who also had some vocals. I was like, yay, we're kind of back together. But
mini reunion.
I mean, it was a decent album, but I think that Gerard Way mainly was using this sort of experiment into this new territory. It wasn't fantastic. I mean, it's nowhere near the caliber of My Chemical Romance, and it's of course nowhere near the style of My Chemical Romance, but it does show good promise, and I am definitely looking forward to see what he does after this.
Scar Symmetry is the Singularity Phase 1 Neo-Humanity. Definitely am a Scar Symmetry fan. Was kind of bummed of the past couple of releases just because I don't think the new vocalists have quite clicked in the way that Christian did for the first 3 Scar Symmetry albums. But this was the album, that's the first album of a 3-album trilogy, and it's great. This is what I've been waiting for from Scar Symmetry, at least personally, and I know that quite a few other critics that had checked out on Scar Symmetry have checked back in because this album is so good, and they really... all the pieces just seem to really fall into place for this album. It is definitely the aggressive death metal sound that Scar Symmetry is known for, with a couple of surprises here and there. And because it's the first part of a 3-part series, there's more to look forward to. And the concept of the album is a pretty deep sci-fi concept. It's Scar Symmetry. Go figure. That's what they do. And it's definitely a promising start to a story that they're going to flesh out in the later releases. So this was definitely not a disappointment in any way, shape, or form.
And OK Go's new album, Hungry Ghost, was sort of venturing out from their original sound, definitely more electronic than before. I mean, they, of course, pulled it off. And, okay, you can't, of course, see music videos on, well, listening to this album, but Writings on the Wall, the music video for that, that's like the greatest music video I have ever seen in my life.
It's phenomenal. I mean, it's as from the video / production guy in me. I mean, it's incredible.
Like, if you haven't seen this music video, please just watch it. It is great, and the rest of the album, of course, definitely was good. If you're hoping for the standard OK Go sound, you'll be disappointed. But I personally am very happy to see them venturing out and doing different styles, even though I'm not the biggest electronic fan, but they definitely make it work.
Ben Howard's I Forget Where We Were. This has gotten so much better in the months since it's come out. He's got such a really unique and really personal and intimate songwriting style and guitar playing style that makes this album such a joy to listen to. His songwriting approach is very mild, very laid back, and even in the moments when he gets aggressive and real powerful, it's still, it doesn't feel forced. It feels totally natural. It feels totally authentic. His guitar playing is wonderful. I mean, this is probably one of my favorite albums of the whole year in terms of just the guitar work on this album. It's very folky, but it's also very experimental, very outside the box thinking in the way he plays, and this definitely made for one of my favorite releases for the whole year, and really in my opinion, one of the best albums that we covered this year, as contrasted to Chris Tomlin's Love Ran Red, which was one of the worst albums that we covered this year. And since we reviewed the Chris Tomlin album, I participated in a couple of back and forths on the interwebs, because that's what I do, and the amount of spinning that has been done in defense of this album is disturbing. The amount of spin that this album has given to try to explain and justify why this album is so mediocre is horrible. It makes me want to pull my hair out. This has to stop. We have to stop trying to come up with reasons to give Chris Tomlin a pass for the fact that he literally uses every single phrase that he has ever used and every worship cliche under the sun. And the fact that the songwriting is literally nothing new that he has ever done. It is more of the same, even more so than Casting Crowns' album. I mean, Casting Crowns at least had a couple of curveballs in there. This one didn't. This one didn't have a single curveball in it.
And it's really sad to see this happen, because Chris Tomlin was a great
he started
singer.
out really solid. I mean the songs that we still sing in church from the old Chris Tomlin era, they're great for a reason. The songs that he's writing out now are totally forgettable, and the only reason people sing them, I would venture to say, and I might be wrong on this, is because it's Chris Tomlin. If some other band were to have written these songs, I don't think anybody would have paid attention to it. But because it's Chris Tomlin, all of a sudden it's gold. And that's wrong. Like, we got to stop this. I should stop before I continue my rant. Go.
And Rancid released Honor Is All We Know this year. I can't remember how long it was. It was like 5 or 6 years since their last release. Rancid, of course, being one of the standard classic punk bands. And, I mean, this was a good, solid release. The only thing that really sort of was a drawback was how incredibly short this album was. I mean, I'm like, okay, if you have been on this big of a hiatus, give us more than half an hour worth of music. Come on.
Well, that's also a thing with punk, too, is that punk is inherently a short-running genre.
Yeah, it is a thing with punk, and, I mean, I do understand to a point, but this is their shortest album ever to be released. It's definitely the shortest album I've ever heard.
It is pretty short.
Yeah. I mean, so maybe if they could have given us even just one more song for this, I would definitely have a higher opinion of it. I mean, it's still good if you're a punk fan, listen to it, but there's not that much material to it.
Devin Townsend Project's Z2. This was one of my most anticipated releases of the year, just because it was the continuation of his famous Ziltoid of the Omniscient release. It's broken up into 2 albums, the first one being Sky Blue, and Sky Blue, it's gotten a little better with time. I mean, I've gotten a little bit more accustomed to the sound that he's trying to go for, the sort of the dance metal pop fusion that he's trying to go for. The soundscapes that he achieves are actually really good, and the album is phenomenally well mixed. It's ear candy as far as the mixing of the album goes and the production of the album. Dark Matters is Ziltoid the Omniscient 2, which is very different from Ziltoid 1, and I still haven't made up my mind as to whether or not I think it's a better or not as better release from the first Ziltoid. It's more in the vein of it's like the soundtrack to an album, or soundtrack to a movie that you haven't seen yet. I used that phrase when I was reviewing the album the first time. Whereas the first Ziltoid was an album that carried the concept and the story of Ziltoid 1, but provided several songs that stood on their own independent of the story that you could listen to and understand. This album doesn't have any of that. This album stands or falls as a whole. There's not any one single song that you can just pick apart and put on the radio or put on something else. It's so linked to the Ziltoid story, which is super funny and freaking hilarious.
Yeah, definitely.
It's so funny. Oh my gosh, such a funny album. That it stands or falls as its own. It's still a relatively enjoyable release. You just have to change your expectations in what you're listening to.
And Slipknot finally released a new album this year. They had a hiatus primarily due to the death of their bassist Paul Gray, which is still definitely a very sad thing for the metal scene. And this is definitely the album Slipknot fans have been waiting for. It's not as long as some of their albums have been, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. And it, of course, has been getting a decent amount of recognition, but I still say their song Nomadic needs more recognition than it has been getting. That song was great. But definitely, if you're an old school Slipknot fan, listen to it. It's good. And it's even got less language than you usually would expect from a Slipknot album. Yeah. And if you haven't been listening to Slipknot much, I mean, this is definitely a good time to get into them.
So, King's Kaleidoscope's Becoming Who We Are. This was the only album of the year that we gave a perfect 10 to, and I still stand by that statement. I still stand by the fact that this is a 10 out of 10 album.
And I have to agree with him. This was a fantastic album.
I've talked about this with people. I've talked this album up with people considerably, so much so since its release. In fact, I even gave the album as a white elephant gift at a Christmas party relatively recently.
Lucky.
Yes, the person who got that. I hope you enjoyed it because it's a great album. I had one criticism of the album come my way that I didn't think of at the time, and I think is a relatively valid criticism, although I don't think it necessarily detracts from the album in any way. I've had one criticism come my way that says that the album is maybe a little too overindulgent in a couple of places in terms of all the sounds that they're trying to go for. Valid point in a couple of places. I'm not going to disagree with that. Does that necessarily make it anything less than a phenomenal release? No. Maybe it just means that they maybe need to scale back some of the instrumentation in a couple of places. But overall, this is the best worship release of the year, by far. And this is the best worship release in the past couple of years, by far. This is absolutely phenomenal. If you are a fan of anything that has come out of the Mars Hill music scene, if you are looking for some actually fresh and lively and different and thought-provoking and engaging and mesmerizing and soul-stirring, and I'm running out of adjectives to describe this album because it's that good, you should listen to King's Kaleidoscope. If you're a Newsboys fan, you got a pleasant treat with Hallelujah for the Cross, which this Newsboys critic has been unbelievably mean sometimes to the Newsboys since Michael Tate took over the scene. But this worship release, I can't say anything bad about it. It was good. It was well done. It was respectful. It was reverent. It's definitely got the Newsboys sound, but they don't overindulge in it, and they don't butcher the songs like some other worship covers I've heard do. In particular, their treatment of All Hail the Power of Jesus' Name is genius. I mean, I was blown away when I first heard it. Definitely a surprise. I was not expecting to like this album, but as far as being a worship cover album, this was not a cheap cash-in that they were just trying to do, to maybe get some extra money raking in. This is a legitimate release, and it is legitimately good.
And this year, we have an excellent new band coming out. Silent Planet released their debut album, The Night God Slept. And unfortunately, I was not able to go see them live. They came to Amarillo, and I was very close to seeing their concert.
You backed out 2 hours before the show.
Yeah, 2 hours before the show. Money just was barely a little bit too tight. But, I mean, this is a very, very good first release. It was more complex than you would expect a first album to be. Every single song flowed perfectly into the other. I mean, absolutely perfectly. There was one really big surprise that happened. The third track, called I Drowned in the Desert, is completely instrumental. And okay, the first two tracks, hard, screaming metal. Then you go to I Drowned in the Desert, and it's very calm, very dreamlike, a little bit of electronic in there, and you're like, okay, I wasn't expecting this, but awesome, this is great. Perfectly ties into the next song, Native Blood. Then track number 5, Tiny Hands, Au Revoir. I mean, it starts out, you're listening to it, yeah, this is a good, hard, metal song. Then they get a guest vocalist who's, I don't know who it was, comes in, and she starts singing beautifully in French. And I'm just like...
Stroke your beard.
Stroke my beard, and I'm like, was not expecting this, but okay, this definitely works. And track number 7, Darkstrand, Hibakusha. I had to look up what Hibakusha means in Japanese, and it's the word attributed to survivors of the nuclear bomb explosions. It literally means explosion affected people. Definitely great song. First Mother Lilith, which when you hear a Christian band have a song that has the word Lilith in it,
Your eyebrows raise.
yeah, your eyebrows raise. And like this was definitely a needed addition to the album because before they had mainly been doing screaming with slowly getting more and more into clean vocals. First Mother Lilith, they definitely show what they can do with clean vocals, and I'm just like, heck yes, excellent way to mix up the album. And the last few tracks, great. Depths 2, the last song, also like First Mother Lilith, brings in the clean vocals in an excellent way. And as much as I love this album, I just have to say I am excited to see what they have coming up because they do not need to go away. They need to stay here for a very long time. And I'd probably pin this album maybe at an 8.75, maybe a 9. But
Okay.
I think I'll stick with 8.75. I mean, because there are, of course, issues with it, like repetition, that sort of stuff. But a lot of it can easily be forgiven because it is their first album.
And then it's not included in the list, but you.
Oh, yeah, that's right. And then another album that was released about the same time was Foo Fighters' Sonic Highways, which I was actually excited for, but
So was I.
definitely failed to meet expectations. It had a very rough, unfinished feel. I mean, I know that like they didn't write the lyrics and a lot of the music until they arrived at the city, which, okay, I can understand that from an artistic point of view. That is a good idea, but they needed to spend more time on this album for sure.
I initially didn't comment on this album because I've been told that this album must be listened to within the context of the documentary. I'm going to comment on the album now because I don't necessarily buy that interpretation anymore, and here's why. You can comment on the album portion of it without having to know what goes on in the documentary, because if the album portion is being released as a standalone thing, it can be criticized as a standalone thing. And as a standalone thing, it sucks.
Yeah.
As a standalone release, this album sucks.
Because, I mean, and we've discussed, maybe not on the show, but, you know, just us two talking about soundtracks of movies, and you can listen to the soundtrack of movies and say, this is a good song, this is a bad song very easily.
Yeah. Now, do I deny that maybe the documentary maybe gives different takes on the songs? Sure, I don't deny that for a second. Do I deny that the documentary might actually make me enjoy the songs maybe a little more? Sure, I don't deny that right off the bat. I don't know some of the stories behind all of these songs, and I know that's what the point of the documentary is. But can the documentary override and change a flawed from the get-go song structure and automatically take a bad song structure, bad lyrics, weak melodies, or anything else that pertains to songwriting and automatically change it into being something good? No.
And actually, funny story, the other day I heard Something From Nothing on the radio, which is one of the least awful songs.
Yeah, that's probably
on
the only
album.
song from the album that I liked.
And I heard the DJ of the radio station talking after it saying, and that was Something From Nothing from Foo Fighters' new album Sonic Highway. There's definitely some good stuff on that album. And then just pick back up, and I'm like, he was forced to say that. I could tell in his voice he had no choice but to say that, but he definitely disagreed with it.
That's hilarious. That's super funny. Project 86's Knives to the Future. One of my definitely most anticipated releases of the year. I had several really anticipated releases this year, and this was definitely one of them. A follow-up album to their outstanding release, Wait for the Siren, which was our 2012 hard rock album of the year. In light of the fact that both Flyleaf and Disciple had some pretty miserable releases, it allowed for Project 86 to come in and really steal my attention as far as hard rock albums that goes. And this one definitely follows up even better than Wait for the Siren. It's a little hard to listen to as far as transitions go in a couple of places. There are a couple of rough transitions here or there, but as far as the songwriting, it's a great release. They have a very forward-thinking songwriting structure when it comes to writing the parts for the guitars. You were to isolate the guitar parts into themselves, and they would not necessarily fit the hard rock sound. Ambigram, Genosha, and Ambergran and Genosha definitely are two of my favorite releases. Back to back, they pack an amazing 1-2 punch. Son of Flame is the sister brother track to Blood Moon from Wait for the Siren, where the Blood Moon was about his daughter. This album is about, of course, his son. It's mostly a hard rock album, but Son of Flame is definitely the softest song on the album, and with good reason. It breaks up the action really well, but it also comes as more of a speed bump than it does a real smooth transition, which in hindsight I think is definitely something they can work on. White Capstone and Oculus probably has one of the best two-part ending suites of any album that I've heard this year. Oculus in particular is bone-chillingly good. Raises my spine up every time I listen to it, just because of how powerful and gorgeous of an ending it is. When the climax of the song hits and the guitars rush in, it's so good. Knives for the Future was definitely one of my favorite releases for the year. I didn't listen to all the hard rock albums that you listen to, Brett. That's mainly your domain. But as far as the hard rock albums that I heard this year, this is easily my favorite. But I don't know how it stood up to some of the other albums. Maybe it did better, maybe it didn't. I don't know. Last new review, we're almost done. We got this and then our two least favorite releases of the year. Ne Oblivis Caris. Try to say that 5 times fast. And their release, Citadel. Ne Oblivis Caris is an Australian extreme progressive metal band. Try to say that 5 times fast. I had commented last week that there was an album that had entered the foray and running for the Album of the Year slot. This is that album. It's hard to describe all of the crap, not crap in the bad sense, but it's hard to describe all of the stuff that's going on in this album at any given point in time. It's only 6 songs long, but it runs the length of a full-length release. It's broken down into 1 3-part song, 1 2-part song, and then 1 single standalone song. The standalone song is nearly 10 minutes. And the second song of the opening 3-part set is nearly 17 minutes. So this is definitely Opeth era, or Opeth area and other progressive metal area where songwriting just goes on, well into the 10-15 minute mark. Here's the thing, as far as a metal album, this is jaw-droppingly good. The screaming is the only thing that maybe could have been done a little better, but as far as the drumming and as far as the guitar work, incredibly technical, incredibly fast, incredibly proficient. It's mind-blowingly good. The violin work is throughout the album is really what makes this album really stand out from some of its other competitors, in that they incorporate some folk violin elements throughout the album, often as a standalone thing for some solos, but even then, it adds so much to it that it really makes the album stand out apart and gives a really nice feature to it. The album opens up with the 3-minute part 1 of Painters of the Tempest. That's the name of the 3-track song, and it has some real rough, ugly, distorted, in all senses terrible violin work. But that's what they're going for, and they pull it off. And the scene that they're trying to create works. Furic is the one song that stands by itself. I think it's actually my favorite song on the album. Devour Me Colossus is the name of the 2-part track. The only thing about this album that I don't necessarily like is that part 2 of Devour Me Colossus just feels kind of tacked on there at the end. It doesn't really transition out very well. The part 1 of it is killer and is great. And the only other major criticism that I have of this album is that the beginning end pieces for the longer multi-part tracks, they don't transition very well. They stand alone really well by themselves, but as far as linking together to the broader piece, they don't really transition very well. They feel kind of forced and tacked on. But as far as the musicianship goes, oh my gosh, where did this come from? It's definitely one of the best metal releases of the year, and I am heavily debating as to whether or not this is album of the year or not. So you'll have to check back next week for that.
And wow, we're not really ending this list on a good note, are we?
No, we're going to end this list on the 2 worst albums that we covered. Well, okay, we're going to end this list on our 2 least favorite releases.
And Nickelback unfortunately released No Fixed Address in November, and my gosh, I mean, I heard Standing on the Edge of Revolution on the radio, and I was like, okay, maybe Nickelback's doing something good here, and I, look at some of the initial reviews, but okay, they're adding some funky, groovy vibes into it, a little bit of electronic. They're experimenting. Okay, interesting. I'll definitely have to listen to it. I listened to it, and there were like 2 or 3 songs that weren't horrible. Everything else was just...
What was the phrase you used?
It's like they took a dump on their microphones, and then on one of the tracks, Flo Rida came in and also took a dump on the microphone. I mean, this was just horrible. If you want to listen to the good parts of Nickelback's album, just listen to the radio. Eventually it'll show. Do not listen to this entire album. Don't do it.
So, One Direction. And what was the hardest moment for me as a critic this year was having to sit in front of this microphone and have to actually say, with the intentions of putting this on the internet for anybody and everybody to hear, that One Direction's newest release, 4, was actually not that bad. It still pains me to say that. I wish I didn't have to say that. But as far as the musicianship of the album goes, it's actually really good. It honestly, truly is. There are a couple of songs on here that if you were to have taken the music for it, and if you were to have put it on some indie college radio station, it would have fit right in and nobody would have noticed. It's where the lyrics come in that the lyrics really, really, really break this album. Blatant idolatry. I mean, literal idolatry in this album. The cheesiest of cheese, teen, tween, romance lyrics, because that's the market they're still going for, even though they're in their 20s now. Total bland pop in the blandest possible sense. There is nothing praiseworthy lyrically, and actually there is quite a bit of condemnable lyrics as far as some of the stuff here in this album.
Girl Almighty.
Yeah, Girl Almighty. That's just the fact that they're targeting teen girls with this album is what really sets me on edge. I mean, any adult can listen to this and take this and reject this as being just a steaming pile of crap, but the fact that so many of these girls are going to take some of these lyrics and their lives are going to be shaped either consciously or subconsciously by these lyrics is really troublesome and really disturbing, because this album is full of an unhealthy imagery when it comes to relationships that are just bad. I mean, it doesn't matter how you slice it. I mean, the relationship advice and the relationship imagery that they use in this album is just crap.
And it's kind of creepy to me that a bunch of guys in their 20s are singing songs like this targeted at preteens.
Well, I mean, that's what they're marketing towards. I mean, if we were to take that argument a little bit forward, it's also equally disturbing that Disney executives have an entire show where they produce and market shows that are based on that crowd, and they're probably even older than they are.
Yeah, fair enough, but that's one thing. But when you're singing love songs like this specifically to preteens,
fair enough. I'll grant you that. I'll definitely grant you that. But okay, we did it. We got through all of them.
Yep.
Guess how long we're running right now?
2.5 hours.
No. If we had done like a fuller, normal show, yeah, we would have been in 2.5 hours. We're almost at an hour 20.
Dang, I did not expect this to go that long. Actually,
I did. Like, I did the math, and I was like, if we spend 2 minutes each on every album that we've covered, and then even longer on the new reviews that we had to do, then this would take quite a while. Noticeably absent from this list. Let's talk about 2 or 3 albums that we didn't get a chance to listen to this week or this year. Noticeably absent from this release is Citizens and Saints' newest album. I couldn't get a hold of it. I wanted to have this in here. I could not get a hold of it.
And Taylor Swift's 1984.
No, that's not a noticeable absent. That's a deliberate absent. I'm not shelling out money for that. I applaud her for taking her music off of streaming services, but that does not mean that I'm going to go out and buy it just because I want to cover it, and I don't want to cover it. Noticeably absent is anything else from the Christian hip-hop scene. And, there were releases from Shy Lin, from Tripoli, from Thistle, from Tadashi, and a bunch of other rappers. We couldn't get to those this year. Noticeably absent is Sam Smith. I was going to get to that, but I couldn't get to it in a way that I felt comfortable speaking on. So that's excluded. I wanted to get to it, couldn't get to it. Noticeably absent is several other releases from several other indie artists that I came across when I was doing stuff with FM90. Actually, I've spent quite a bit of time these past couple of weeks listening to Church's debut album, thinking that Church's debut album came out this year. It did not. It came out in 2013. I felt like an idiot when I spent all that time listening to it, because now I'm hooked to Church's debut album, and I wish I could include it in here, but I can't. Brett, was there anything that you can think of that noticeably missing releases from the year?
No, I think you pretty much covered it all.
I mean, as far as the things you were going to cover, you can't think of anything that you wanted to cover but couldn't.
Well, Smashing Pumpkins, I wanted to get to that.
Smashing Pumpkins, we couldn't.
Stuff happened.
Yeah, Smashing Pumpkins, we didn't cover. So there are several albums I know.
And Angels and Airwaves.
Yeah, and Angels and Airwaves. Yeah, there are several albums that, or AC/DC's newest album. We didn't get to that. We missed quite a bit of stuff, and I know that, and I realize that, and I apologize for that. Next year, we will definitely make an effort to not miss as much as we missed this year, and we're also going to make an effort to not have it be so metal-handed as far as what we're listening to. We're going to try to branch out and cover more pop, cover more folk, cover more rap, cover some other genres that we're not necessarily comfortable with, to broaden out and sort of round out the fact that the majority of the releases that we covered on here were metal and hard rock releases, which is what we listen to, but we also want to cover a bunch of other things. But Brett, let's start wrapping this show up. Brett, you got any recos this week?
Yes, recently I discovered a smartphone game called BioInk, very similar to Plague Inc., except instead of trying to wipe out a mass population of people, you're trying to wipe out one person. If you're not really into something...
That's an interesting twist.
Yeah, if you're not really into something that dark, then maybe pass it over. But instead of sort of evolving different mass-produced symptoms, you're trying to shut down different systems in the human body. You can aim for just one, which will eventually do the collapse of a bunch of them, or aim for a lot of different systems in the human body to collapse. Very, very difficult, a very strategic game, and I definitely enjoy it.
I want to recommend Shiner Holiday Cheer.
You're welcome.
Because I was just kind of... You were insistent that I drink this Shiner Holiday Cheer, and I was just kind of like, Shiner, whatever. But, wow. Like, the peaches, the peach and pecan flavor that they brew this beer with, I on paper, I would have said no to that. But once I started drinking it, I was like, this is awesome.
Yes, and yours truly got the absolute last case of it available in Amarillo for the year.
I've learned my lesson. Next year, I will remember and I will buy.
Yes.
This is definitely the season for good winter seasonal beers. I'm so thankful that Amarillo finally got a hold of Sierra Nevada's Celebration IPA. I was about to be really disappointed that we couldn't get that, and then you texted me Friday with a picture of it, and I just like screamed in my car.
Yeah.
I was just like, oh my gosh, we have it! I was so excited, and I was so happy. But yes, Shiner Holiday Cheer is my reco for the year, except that depending on where you live, you can't get it now.
Yeah, I think Shiner's done brewing it for the year, so if you haven't got a hold of it, the stores are probably sold out, so you probably won't be able to get it anytime soon, but next year, the second you see it, buy it.
Yeah, I definitely agree. If you see it, buy it. It's delicious. Even if the idea of peaches and pecans in your beer doesn't sit well with you, because it didn't sit well with me, it's totally worth it. It's delicious. It is so good. Yeah, definitely my record for this week. We want to take time every episode, of course, to mention the gospel. And how does the gospel necessarily relate to listening to a bunch of new albums and then giving our opinions of it? Directly, it doesn't. Directly, there's not necessarily an explicit link between the gospel and listening to a bunch of albums and giving our opinion on them. But there is something to be said for listening to a bunch of albums for the sake of effectively communicating the gospel in avenues where music discussions come up. Knowing what albums are being released, knowing what albums are saying, knowing what direction albums and artists are going allows for opportunities for the gospel to be clarified and defended where occasionally the topic comes up. As music lovers, we have been given these passions and desires for music and enjoying music and talking about music by God, and it certainly is an avenue where not only is the gospel needed, where the message of God reconciling us back to him on the account of his son is totally and completely needed, but is also really appropriate. And God does not just necessarily redeem all of us in terms of our broken sinfulness. Through the gospel, all of creation will be redeemed in the end, and that includes music, and we look forward to the day when we listen to music in a light, in a way that the world has never heard before and never will hear again. So we always want to mention the fact that we don't do this, and we do this because we love music, and we do this because we enjoy music, but the foundational reason for why we enjoy music, the way we enjoy music, is because of the gospel, and is because of the fact that of Christ's work on the cross, that we can enjoy music, knowing that our enjoyment of music is a gift that he has given us. So this is a long episode. Thank you for listening to it.
Yes.
Next week, we will be back with our end of the year episode, and then we've got quite a few things planned for 2015. I'm not going to go ahead and talk about them yet, just because most of them aren't finalized yet, but we have a lot of exciting things in the works for 2015. I've personally got some exciting works in going on for 2015. Not going to talk about it here on this episode, but we'll definitely talk about it next episode. Speaking of next episode, not going to be appearing on Monday like we normally release episodes. Brett's going to be out of town. I'm going to be spending time with my family for Christmas. So we will get that episode to you either Tuesday or Wednesday. It's definitely going to come. It's just going to be a couple of days late, but it will be out before January 1st, 2015.
Definitely.
We want to wish everybody a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. We definitely want to wish you great times with your family, or if you're by yourself, we pray that you find people to spend time with and that you would enjoy this day. Or if you're Brett and if you're working, that your work day is not quite as sucky as it could be. But no, we definitely want to wish everybody a very Merry Christmas, and we will see you again before the new year ends, and then we will end the year out on a great note. We'll talk about the best albums that came out this year, and we'll talk about what you can expect from us in 2015, which we've got a lot on the plate for 2015. We've got the capacity to pull it off now, so I'm really excited for what the future holds for us. But until then, if Santa comes through your chimney, don't shoot him, give him a lot of cookies. Don't give him any eggnog because he's got to drive and he doesn't need to crash into anything. Y'all have a great week.